In this lesson, we will learn how to use CSS to add style to our HTML tables. Now, we learned in an earlier lesson that we should not use tables for layout purposes, and that we should only use tables when we have actual tabular data that we want to display. So let's dive straight into a visual demonstration. In front of you is an example page, and to be more specific, here is an example table. Now, this table does not have an ounce of CSS applied to it, so its appearance is incredibly bare-boned. So this is the browser default for rendering a table, and I think we can do better. I think that by applying a bit of custom CSS to this table, we can make it beautiful, and we can also make it easier for visitors to actually read and distill the data in the table. So I'm going to switch over to a new tab now where I have written a bit of CSS, and we can see that the table matches the overall design of the page, and in my opinion, it's a bit easier to actually read the table. But looking at a finished product isn't very educational or helpful, so I'm going to switch back over to this tab, and we are going to spend the remainder of this lesson working together to write CSS and improve the appearance of our table. Let's get started. Alright, so the first thing that I want to adjust is the text alignment of the table headers. So we can see they are currently centered, but I want them to be aligned to the left. So we can see that in the table head section of our table, this first row uses TH or table header elements. The rest of our table, the actual data in our table, uses TD for table data. So let's begin by targeting these TH elements. Over in our CSS, let's create a new area. I'll create a comment, table styles. Within any table element, look for the table header elements, and let's override their text align to be left. Excellent. Next, I want to give the table headers an alternate background color so that it stands out from the actual data in the table. So to do that, within this same rule, I will say background color. I will paste in the hexadecimal color code for a green that we are using elsewhere on the page. Let's make the text white, and let's also give it a text shadow so it pops. We don't want any blur on the shadow, and we'll use a transparent black value. Next, let's add a border around each table header element and each table data or cell. So to do that, we are going to want to select both the table header elements, comma, let's tack on another selector, and all of the TD elements. Border, so we want a border on all four corners, the top, bottom, left, and right. So border, we want it to be 1 pixel thick. We want it to be a solid line. We don't want it to be dotted or dashed. And we want to use a color, that same green value. So we've added borders, but they look a bit funny, especially if I zoom in a bit further. You can see that there's space in between each table cell, which looks a bit odd, so I imagine that you would want to remove that. So to get rid of that, we need to select the actual table element, the parent element itself. So the selector is simply table. If we look at our HTML, the root of the entire table is simply table. So once we've selected that in our CSS, we want to use the border spacing property and provide it a value of 0. We can see that that removed the awkward spacing between the cells, but now the borders are too thick. So we can see that anytime two cells touch, the border is now 2 pixels thick, because the borders are smashing up against each other. Ideally, we only want a single border to be used between each cell. So to fix this, once again on the table element itself, we can use the property named border collapse and provide it a value of collapse. Excellent. Now you may notice something else that's odd about the table, and that is that it's not using the full available width of our column. By default, tables attempt to shrink wrap themselves, so they will only take up as much horizontal space as they absolutely need. Now if we want to give our content a bit of extra breathing room and make sure that it uses the full available column width, all we need to do is, while we're selecting the table element itself, provide it a width of 100%. Next, let's give each individual cell a bit of breathing room so that it doesn't sit flush against the borders. So to do that, we will want to work with the rule that is targeting both the table headers and the TD table cell elements. Let's add a bit of padding. Padding, 10 pixels. Next, let's add zebra striping. Zebra striping means we want every other row to use a different background color so that it's easier for the human eye to track a row across its entire width. To do this, we will need to create an entirely new rule. Within any table element, let's look for the T-body area. Actually, let's hop over to the HTML structure really quick. So within this section of the table, the section that actually contains the data, we want to grab every other new table row. So we will target TR for table row, and then use a pseudo selector of nth child odd. Now this selector will grab every other table row element, and then within every other table row element, we want to select all of the TD cells. And then we simply want to give them an alternate background color. So I will use a green that we're using for the sidebar of the web page. So now if we refresh, excellent. We could alternatively, instead of odd, say even, and then that will just simply switch. So the current cell, instead of being green, will be white, and then every other cell will be green. Now, another thing that you might have noticed about our table is that we haven't had any control over the width of each column. So let's imagine that we do want to have fine-grained control, and we only want the first column to be about this wide. Since tables adhere to a very strict grid layout, we only need to adjust the width of the first item of each column. So to do that, in our HTML, we can simply add unique classes to these initial table header elements. So let's add a class to item name named call for column, item name. Now these class names don't have any inherent meaning. I'm making them up. You could choose any naming system that you would like to use. Call quantity, call price. So now we can reference these classes in our CSS. So let's create a new rule, call item name. Now we said that we wanted the first column to take up about this much space. So let's use percentages. Let's say width equals 60%. And let's select call quantity and call price and give them a width of 20%. We always want this to add up to 100%. So 60 plus 20 plus 20 is 100%. Now that we have these custom column sizes in place, let's imagine that we want the first column to continue using text-align left, but we want these second and third columns to use text-align center. Now instead of adding a special class to each and every one of these cells, we can simply create a new rule and use advanced selectors. So let's scroll down. Let's create a new rule inside any table element. Look inside each and every table row element, and once you're in the table row, only select the second and third item. So let's look at our HTML structure really quickly. The current selector of table TR will dig into each table row. So this is a table row, this is a table row, this is a table row, and then we only want it to select the second and third item. So those two, these two, these two. So to do that, once we've dug into the TR element, we can then look for only the second and third child. So nth child 2, let's copy this line, comma, and 3. So we only want the second and third items. And once we have them selected, we simply want to use text-align center. So if we refresh, there you have it. Now I will point out the way that we've been structuring our selectors in this lesson is the way you would do it if you were setting up baseline styles, meaning these styles will affect any and every table element on your website. Now that makes sense for setting up background colors and padding, but it probably doesn't make sense for randomly selecting every second and third cell in each row, Because what if on a separate page, what if on the About page we had a table that had 5 columns? So what I suggest we do here is add a unique class to this table on the main parent element. Let's give it a class of grocery list. And then in our CSS, when we are making these complex selectors based on the second and third child, let's adjust the selector table dot grocery list. Table dot grocery list. So that way, these somewhat ambiguous selectors are only being applied to tables that use the grocery list class. So if we had a table that had 6 or 7 columns, these rules wouldn't get applied. So with that organizational bit out of the way, let's get back to the fun. Let's make the final stylistic change for this lesson. So we can see that this item's name is too long to fit within the column, and it drops down to a second line. Now that obviously affects the height of this entire row. It is taller than all of the other rows. And if I zoom in, and if you look very closely, you can see that the quantity and price text are vertically centered. They are only a single line, but this text is 2 lines. So this means that if you look very closely, this 4 sits a few pixels lower than this text does. And maybe you don't want that. So maybe you want to override the web browser's default behavior of vertically aligning this content. So to do that, all we need to do is find the rule that's selecting all of our cells and provide it a property of vertical align. Now by default, the web browser is saying vertical align middle, but we don't want that. We want to override that with vertical align top. So now when I refresh, wait for it, let me zoom in and look very closely. 3, 2, 1. We can see that these 2 cells are now perfectly vertically aligned with the content in the left cell. So that's how you can control the vertical alignment. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. Now, to be honest, many of you will never find yourself needing to style tables. Some of you will, some of you won't. But at the very least, this lesson introduced you to a few new types of selectors, namely the nth child pseudo-selector, which you can use for much more than just selecting different table cells. So we will see the nth child pseudo-selector used again later in the course. I encourage you to download the demo zip for this lesson, play around with some of the table styles and some of the selectors, see where your curiosity takes you, have fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.